Hello and welcome back to another update where I cover the latest developments throughout the front line in the Russo-Ukrainian war. It is your host Weeb Union, and in this one we start out in the direction of the Pokrovsk section of the front line, where the Russians have managed to capture the village of Petisha in the southern part of the front line. They are also advancing towards the Ukrainian fortified positions to the north of Koronevo and east of Serit. At the same time, the Russians are also storming the town of Novohrodivka, where they have managed to capture a significant portion of the Ukrainian fortified positions outside of the town, and have managed to gain a foothold in the southern parts of the town as well as in the eastern parts. We've previously seen an assault by the Russians along the railways, where they managed to expand northwards and southern direction towards the fortified positions, gaining a foothold. Since then, they have now expanded to gain a foothold within the town itself, as well as along the fortified positions, moving down south to gain a foothold in the southern parts as well. Therefore, we see that the Russians have managed to gain a wide foothold within the town and will likely try to push here along the southern parts, both in the direction of Novohrodivka to the south and along the southern parts of the town, as well as in the northern direction along the fortified positions towards the railway and along the railway. So we see that the Russians will here be looking to gain control over the outskirts of the town before moving into the central parts. This is likely due to the fortified positions of the Ukrainians among the high-rise apartment complexes within the town. We see that the Ukrainians have a lot of fortified positions and areas where they can group up in, and in that case the Russians are spending their time hitting the flanks and trying to weaken their positions by enclosing them in areas where supplies will not be arriving towards them, and to push the Ukrainians back towards the next line of defense. At the same time, trying to overrun the next line of defense by going quickly through it rather than taking their time, which will leave the Ukrainians little time to develop their defenses further north. We see that the Ukrainians have this third line of defense ahead of Pokrovsk, spanning from the northern parts of Rodivka all the way to Zelene in the west, and the town of Novohrodivka is ahead of this line of defense. But if we take a look at the topographic map, we can see that the town of Novohrodivka here is also located on the heights similar to the fortified positions on the next line of defense of the Ukrainians. This means that the town of Novohrodivka is a forward defensive position which the Ukrainians are holding to prevent a Russian entry into the fortified positions from a high ground position. If we take a look at Rodivka, it is located on the low ground. This means that the fortified positions beyond it are all located at a higher elevation than the town itself. And similarly, if we take a look at the southern direction, the Russians could advance here in between Novohrodivka and Serit. However, that would be in close proximity to Ukrainian fortified positions and they would be under direct fire. Therefore, the Russians, to push towards the next line of defense located here beyond Rodivka along the high ground towards the south of Pokrovsk, their best bet is to take the town of Novohrodivka here in the central parts, which will lead the Russians to have a better position to attack the next line of defense. At the same time, we saw the Russians moved along the village chain here to the east of Novohrodivka, which allows them to flank the rear of Novohrodivka. And we are seeing exactly that taking place with the Russian capture of Krychyi Yar. They are now right next to the next line of defense of the Ukrainians. They have the height advantage. They are in fortified positions, which makes it difficult for the Russians to push further beyond. But the positions here allows them to be towards Novohrodivka at a wide front and to secure the flank ahead of the Russians attempting to gain control or the fortified positions north of the town, which will lead the Russians to have a better position to move along the railways and all the way towards the northern parts of Novohrodivka and the start of the third line of defense of the Ukrainians in the Pokrovsk direction. Moving on to the Toretsk section of the front line, we see here that the Russians, for the first time in this war, have managed to gain a foothold inside of the city of Toretsk. We see that they have managed to capture all of the apartment high-rise complexes here in the eastern parts, leaving only a small part in the gray zone, and this is ahead of the residential area. This means that the Russians, with this control over the fortified positions here in the eastern parts of Toretsk, will have practically an open field in the entire eastern part of Toretsk. They'll likely take advantage of this capture to push down in the southern direction to connect with the Russian forces further south. They will also take this as an advantage to push towards the central parts and southern parts of Toretsk to gain a wide foothold within the city and to continue pushing directly towards the central parts of the city to prevent the Ukrainians from establishing proper fortified positions within the central parts of the city. So we see heavy fighting is taking place within the city of Toretsk and will only intensify as time goes by. Now that the Russians have full control over the second line of defense in the Toretsk direction, and there is no additional lines of defense, the Russian advances will likely speed up. Moving on, we see here in the Novohrodivka section of the front line, the Russians have improved their positions west of the town, but have managed to gain control over a fortified position of the Ukrainians. This is a new advance in a series of attempts by the Russians to expand their control in the southern flank of Bakhmut. The objective here is to gain full control over the Klishivka direction to then push on towards the canal, down south from the Ivanivska direction and up north from the Andreevka-Kurdyomivka direction to connect all of these and gain full control over the eastern parts of the canal, especially with the fighting both in the Chasiv Yar direction expanding towards the eastern parts of the city and in the Toretsk section where the Russians have now entered the city for the first time. The Russians would have this central part between Toretsk and Chasiv Yar as a very important battlefield as well. It will allow the Russians, for example, to flank the Toretsk direction, to move directly towards Konstantinivka, or to flank the Chasiv Yar direction. It will allow the Russians to significantly improve their positions within the fighting in both of these cities and to initiate fighting in the third city, which connects the two. This area here between Chasiv Yar in the north and Toretsk in the south, this section of the front line is one offensive that is organized between both of these sides. This means that the Russians fighting in Toretsk are communicating with the ones fighting in Chasiv Yar. They are both moving in unison to improve their positions both in the northern and southern flank to then start a common offensive towards Konstantinivka. This is at the same time as the Russians are also launching a similar operation in the Pokrovsk direction, where the ones fighting in the west towards Pokrovsk and the ones fighting in the south towards Karelivka and Koronevo are working together to launch these operations on a larger scale. These are two massive operations that the Russians are launching at the same time, as the number of soldiers is simply a lot, and the operations are still in their initial stages. We'll likely see the fighting of Pokrovsk and Koronevo take place within a month's time, and the same in Chasiv Yar and Toretsk. The fighting will continue over this next month's period of time, where the objective here in the east is Konstantinivka and objective in the west is both Pokrovsk and Koronevo. In the Kreminna section of the front line along the Serit river, the Ukrainians have launched a counterattack here north of Novohrodivka. We see here that the Ukrainians, according to Deep State Map, between the 12th and 15th of August, launched a series of attacks here along the forest area, allowed the Ukrainians to align the front line by the Serit river here west of Novohrodivka. This is at the same time as the Russians are fighting in the direction of Makiivka. So we see that the Russians and the Ukrainians are fighting on each their side of the river line. The Ukrainians are seeing that the Russians want to expand their control over the Serit river line and to go beyond it. So similarly, the Ukrainians are responding by expanding their own control in the western bank of the river line to prevent the Russians from taking advantage of the control over Makiivka to launch an operation beyond, because the Ukrainians would then have cleared up the area so that foothold across would be very shallow and more dangerous for the Russians to take advantage of. In the Kursk section of the front line, we see here that there are several developments. Starting out in the western parts along the same section of the front line, the Ukrainians managed to gain control over parts of the Krasno village here by the river line. We see that the Ukrainians have been developing the offensive operations here in the western parts along Snagost and several other villages in the nearby area, where they are moving slowly towards the Russian positions along the river line in the southern bank of it. The Ukrainians have already blown up all of the bridges and are constantly attacking any pontoon bridges the Russians are setting up to limit the supplies the Russians are able to supply as much as possible. In the northern parts, we see here that the Ukrainians are expanding their flanking maneuver on Koronevo by gaining control over additional two villages here in the northern parts. The objective of the Ukrainians here is to secure the northern flank ahead of an operation to gain control over Koronevo, Turovka, Shebolovka, and Vetronevo, to gain control over the northern flank of Koronevo, securing that possession, and then launching offensive operations directly towards Koronevo itself. So we see that the Ukrainians are expanding their offensive operations in the north as well. At the same time, the Russians are seen to be present in the villages of Pokrovsk and Orlovka. This shows that they are moving to secure the eastern flank. This will allow the Russians to then hit the Ukrainians in their supply route towards the northern flank. If Russians are able to connect between Koronevo and the east, they'll be able to cut off the Ukrainian presence in the north. However, the Ukrainians are still pressing on. This is still the initial phases of the Ukrainian Kursk offensive. After reading a lot of reports, most of them suggest that there is a significant concentration of Ukrainian forces here in the north that is completely beyond what we have seen so far initiated in the fighting. The Ukrainians fighting in the Kursk region right now is somewhere between 10 and 15,000. Some reports suggest that the Ukrainians have gathered up to a total of 100,000 here in the north, similar to the number of Ukrainian soldiers who were fighting in the Zaporizhia front. So we're seeing that the Ukrainians may have a large offensive operation planned here in the north. According to some reports, they also believe that the Ukrainians will expand to Bryansk and Belgorod as well. We see this footage here near the Bryansk and Kursk border here in the north, where the Russians are moving a column of equipment here in the northern parts, where they end up fighting with a Ukrainian reconnaissance group. So we see that there are several developments across the border areas, and this may very well still just be the beginning of the Ukrainian Kursk offensive. So we see that the Russians and the Ukrainians are simply not launching simple operations in the east and in the north, but these are actually large-scale operations where both sides have large plans in mind, and at the same time both sides have a large concentration of their own forces during their offensive operations. At the same time, the Russians do not simply have a few units in the north either. According to some reports, the Russian number of troops fighting in the Kursk region itself is around 10,000 soldiers, and this is only due to the fact that it is only partial units fighting in the Kursk region. The rest of the groupings of the different units are located around the Bryansk and Belgorod regions. They are spreading their forces thin across the border area to prevent another breakthrough similar to what the Ukrainians did in the Kursk direction. This means that the amount of soldiers the Russians have available at the border area is unknown, but it is numbered somewhere around 50,000 in total. This means that the Russians do have a significant amount of troops available, although the Ukrainians outnumber them theoretically 2 to 1. We do not know exactly the compositions, and this is all based on reports that cannot be confirmed, as no one of us are really present at the front line, unless you are, in which case you wouldn't confirm or deny my information. And that is going to be all for this update. Thank you all for watching. Make sure to leave a like, subscribe, and check out my Patreon for additional content. Thank you all for watching, and have a great day.